It was a chilly autumn evening when Representative David walked into the bustling police precinct, his worn leather jacket and faded jeans making him look like any other person from the neighborhood. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as he approached the front desk, where a heavy-set desk sergeant was buried in his phone, barely acknowledging the new arrival. The waiting area was filled with the usual sounds, phones ringing in the background, officers shuffling papers, and the quiet murmur of conversations. A young mother tried to calm her crying baby in one corner, while an elderly man dozed off in an uncomfortable plastic chair. David stood patiently at the desk, noting how the sergeant didn't even bother to look up. "Can I help you?" the sergeant finally asked, his tone making it clear that helping was the last thing he wanted to do. His nameplate read Officer Wilson, though it was partially covered by a coffee-stained document. "Yes, I need to file a complaint about the increased break-ins in the Oak Street area," David replied calmly, pulling out a small notebook where he documented dates and incidents. The sergeant's eyes barely flickered toward the notebook before he reached under his desk and pulled out a wrinkled complaint form. "Fill this out and drop it in that box," he said, pointing to an overflowing plastic container labeled Civilian Complaints. "We'll get to it when we can." He immediately went back to his phone, signaling that the conversation was over. David glanced at the form, then at the growing pile of similar papers in the box. "Sir, this is actually quite urgent. We've had 3 break-in attempts just this week, and the community is getting worried. Could I possibly speak with a supervisor?" That got a reaction, though not the one he'd hoped for. The sergeant let out a dry laugh, finally looking up. 2 younger officers standing nearby, finishing their shift paperwork, snickered at David's request. "Listen, buddy," one of them called out, coffee cup in hand. "Everyone thinks their problem is urgent. The supervisor's busy with real police work. Fill out the form like everybody else." David noticed how they looked at his clothes, his unpolished shoes, the way they'd already decided he wasn't worth their time. He pulled out his phone and quietly made a few notes, watching as the officers exchanged knowing looks. "Sir, I really must insist," David tried again, his voice remaining steady and professional. "The situation in our neighborhood needs immediate attention. There are families at risk. And there's a procedure to follow." The sergeant cut him off, sliding the form closer to David. "Either fill it out or leave. Your choice." What they didn't know, couldn't have known, was that David was carefully recording every word, every dismissive gesture, every moment of their interaction. As the head of the State Appropriations Committee, he'd been conducting an undercover study of police responsiveness across different neighborhoods. This precinct's budget review was scheduled for next week, and they'd just given him exactly what he needed to push for serious changes. David picked up the form, thanked them politely, and walked toward the plastic chairs. He sat down, pulled out a pen, and began writing, all while making mental notes about the changes this precinct would soon be facing. Sometimes, he thought, the best lessons come from unexpected teachers. David sat quietly filling out the complaint form, watching the daily life of the precinct unfold around him. 2 officers walked past him, their boots squeaking on the freshly mopped floor. One of them, a tall officer with gray-streaked hair, was telling his partner about his plans for the weekend. "Hey, did you see that guy trying to act all important?" The younger officer whispered, not quite quietly enough. He gestured toward David with a slight tilt of his head. "Bet he's one of those people who thinks they know how to do our job better than us." The older officer chuckled, taking a sip from his paper coffee cup. "Yeah, they all want special treatment. Like we don't have real crimes to deal with." Their laughter echoed through the lobby, making a few other waiting citizens shift uncomfortably in their seats. David continued writing, his pen moving steadily across the paper. He could feel the weight of his phone in his pocket, still recording everything. The dismissive attitude, the casual disrespect, it was all building a clear picture of what regular people faced every day. An elderly woman walked in, clutching her purse tightly. She looked scared, probably there to report something that had happened to her. David watched as she approached the front desk, her hands shaking slightly as she tried to get the surgeon's attention. "Just take a number and wait," the sergeant barked without looking up, pointing to a machine with a roll of red tickets. The woman jumped at his harsh tone, her shoulders slumping as she pulled a number and found a seat. David felt his jaw tighten. As head of the State Appropriations Committee, he'd seen the budget requests from this precinct. They'd asked for increased funding for community outreach programs, claiming they were dedicated to building better relationships with the public. What he was seeing told a very different story. The two officers who'd been joking about him earlier were now at the desk, filling out their end-of-shift reports. "Another waste of time," one muttered, tossing a complaint form into the already overflowing box. People see one suspicious person, and suddenly it's an emergency. David stood up, walking to the desk to submit his completed form. The sergeant barely glanced at it before dropping it into the box with the others. "We'll contact you if we need more information," he said dismissively, already turning away. "Thank you for your time," David replied politely, adjusting his worn jacket. "I look forward to hearing back about this matter. Very soon." There was something in his tone that made the younger officer look up, but David was already heading toward the door. As he stepped outside into the cool evening air, David pulled out his phone and stopped the recording. Next week's budget meeting was going to be very interesting. These officers had no idea that their behavior today would be Exhibit A in his presentation about the need for major departmental reforms. He thought about the elderly woman still waiting inside, about all the other citizens who deserved better. Change was coming to this precinct, whether they were ready for it or not. Sometimes the most powerful lessons come from the people you underestimate the most. Walking to his car, David made a few quick notes about what he'd seen. The disrespect, the dismissive attitudes, the clear gap between what the department claimed in their budget requests and how they actually treated people. It was all going to come to light soon enough. For now, though, he was just another frustrated citizen walking away from the precinct, exactly as they expected. Back in his modest home office, David spread out his notes across the wooden desk he'd inherited from his father. The evening light filtered through the window as he reviewed the recordings from his visit to the police precinct. His wife brought him a cup of tea, shaking her head as she listened to snippets of the officer's dismissive comments. "I can't believe they treat people like that," she said, setting down the steaming cup. "And to think they're asking for more funding next week." She knew her husband's role on the committee, understood why he had to see things firsthand instead of just reading reports. David clicked through the files on his laptop, pulling up statistics from other precincts across the state. This wasn't an isolated incident. He'd been gathering evidence for months. Some stations showed excellent community engagement, while others, like the one he'd visited today, seemed to have forgotten who they were meant to serve. His phone buzzed with a text from one of his committee members. "You won't believe what I just heard," it read. "That precinct you visited. They're planning to send their youngest officers to the budget meeting. Think they'll charm us with fresh faces." David smiled slightly, thinking about those same young officers who'd mocked him earlier. They had no idea they'd been picked to face the very man they'd dismissed. His desk calendar showed the meeting was just 3 days away, circled in red ink. Opening another folder on his laptop, he reviewed video clips from his previous visits to different neighborhoods. A shop owner describing how police ignored calls from his area. A group of elderly residents afraid to walk to the local park because their complaints about suspicious activity went uninvestigated. Each story added another piece to the puzzle. His teenage daughter poked her head into the office. "Dad, you should see what people are saying online about that precinct," she said, showing him her phone. Local community groups were filled with similar stories. Calls ignored, complaints dismissed, people feeling unheard and unprotected. David rubbed his tired eyes, thinking about the elderly woman he'd seen at the station. He checked the precinct's public records. They claimed a response time under 15 minutes for all neighborhoods. But his research showed something very different. Some areas waited hours for officers to show up, if they came at all. The family dog wandered in, resting his head on David's knee as if sensing his concern. As he scratched behind the dog's ears, David thought about how to present his findings. This wasn't about punishment, it was about fixing a broken system. He pulled out a fresh notepad and began outlining his presentation for the budget meeting. The evidence was clear: recorded interactions, response time data, community feedback, and now his personal experience. But more importantly, he had ideas for real changes: better training, community engagement programs that actually worked, and accountability measures that meant something. His wife returned with a sandwich, knowing he'd work late into the night. "Just remember," she said, squeezing his shoulder, "those officers are people too. They need guidance, not just punishment." David nodded, adding another note to his outline. The goal wasn't to shame anyone, but to build something better. Real change wouldn't come from angry confrontations, but from showing them a better way forward. As night fell outside his window, David reviewed one last piece of evidence: the complaint form he'd filled out at the precinct. He wondered how long it would sit in that overflowing box, unread and unaddressed. Soon enough, they'd understand why every complaint, every citizen, and every interaction mattered. The morning of the budget hearing arrived with a buzz of activity in the state capitol building. David straightened his tie as he walked down the marble hallway, his footsteps echoing off the walls. Today, he wasn't wearing his worn jacket and jeans. This time, his tailored suit and polished shoes reflected his true position. Inside the meeting room, committee members shuffled papers and sipped coffee. The police department representatives hadn't arrived yet. David could hear nervous chatter outside the heavy wooden doors. He smiled, thinking about the surprise waiting for those young officers who'd been so dismissive just days ago. Right on time, the precinct delegation walked in. David had to hide his amusement as he recognized the faces: the two young officers who'd laughed at him, now wearing their dress uniforms and looking confident. Their smiles froze when they saw him sitting at the head of the committee table. "Please, take your seats," David said calmly, gesturing to the chairs across from him. The younger officer's face had gone pale, recognition dawning in his eyes. His partner was frantically whispering something, probably explaining who David really was. "Before we begin," David continued, his voice carrying across the now silent room, "I'd like to share some interesting findings about community service in your precinct." He pressed a button, and the large screen behind him came to life. The recording from his visit played clearly: their dismissive laughs, the harsh treatment of citizens, the overflowing complaint box. With each clip, the officers sank lower in their chairs. Their confidence from moments ago had evaporated completely. "Now," David said, pausing the video, "let's talk about the funding you're requesting for community outreach programs." He pulled out the wrinkled complaint form he'd filled out. "I'm particularly interested in how you plan to address response times in different neighborhoods." One of the committee members passed out packets showing response time data across different areas. The younger officer flipped through the pages, his hands shaking slightly. The evidence was clear: some neighborhoods waited hours longer than others for help. We didn't," the officer stammered, looking desperately at his partner for help. The older officer just stared at the table, unable to meet David's eyes. "This isn't meant to embarrass you," David said kindly, his tone softening. "This is about making things better. Real community service means serving everyone equally." He clicked to the next slide, showing successful programs from other precincts. The room grew warmer as David outlined his proposal: not just budget cuts, but a complete overhaul of their training and community engagement. The officers gradually lifted their heads, surprise showing on their faces as they realized this wasn't going to be the public scolding they'd expected. "Your precinct has potential," David continued, sharing stories of officers who'd made positive changes in other stations. "But it starts with understanding that every person who walks through your doors deserves respect." The younger officer reached for his water glass, his hand steadier now. His partner had started taking notes, actually paying attention to the suggested improvements. The atmosphere in the room had shifted from tense to hopeful. So, David concluded, setting down his papers, "Shall we discuss how to make these changes work?" He smiled warmly, showing them that this was a chance for real improvement, not punishment. Word spread quickly through the precinct about what had happened at the budget meeting. The front desk sergeant sat up straighter now, his phone tucked away in a drawer. Officers gathered in small groups, whispering about the congressman they dismissed just days ago. The police chief called an emergency meeting that afternoon. The usual buzz of the precinct was replaced by nervous energy as officers filed into the briefing room. The two young officers from the budget meeting stood at the front, their faces still showing traces of embarrassment as they shared their experience. "He could have destroyed our careers," the younger one explained, his voice carrying to the back of the room. "Instead, he showed us everything we've been doing wrong and how to fix it." His partner nodded, holding up the thick folder of improvement plans they'd brought back. The chief stood up, looking more serious than anyone had seen him in years. "Starting today, things change," he announced, writing on the whiteboard. "Every complaint gets logged properly. Every citizen gets treated with respect. No exceptions." Outside the briefing room, a young mother walked in clutching a crying baby. The desk sergeant, who just days ago would have barely looked up, immediately stood and found her a comfortable chair. He brought her a cup of water and helped her fill out the forms she needed. The elderly woman from earlier that week returned, surprised to find an officer already reviewing her case. "We've assigned extra patrols to your neighborhood," he explained kindly, showing her the schedule on his computer. "Here's my direct number if you need anything else." Back in the briefing room, the chief pinned up response time maps across different neighborhoods. Red marks showed where they'd failed their community, too slow to respond, too quick to dismiss. "This isn't about losing funding," he said firmly. "It's about remembering why we took this job in the first place." Officers took turns sharing stories of times they could have done better. One remembered brushing off a teenager reporting bike thefts. Another admitted to ignoring complaints from certain neighborhoods. The room grew quiet as they realized how far they'd strayed from their mission to serve and protect. The younger officer who'd faced David at the budget meeting raised his hand. "The congressman told me something I can't forget," he said, standing up. "He said every person who walks through those doors is someone's family member. They could be anyone, even the person who controls our budget." Nervous laughter rippled through the room. By late afternoon, changes were already visible. The overflowing complaint box had been replaced with a proper filing system. Officers were spending more time listening to citizens instead of rushing them out the door. The precinct felt different, more welcoming, more like it was meant to be. A delivery arrived, new community outreach materials and training guides. But more importantly, there was a handwritten note from David. "This isn't about punishment," it read. "It's about building trust. Show your community you're here for them, and they'll be there for you." The chief posted the note on the bulletin board where everyone could see it. Below it, he added a simple message. "Every person matters. Every call counts. Every interaction is a chance to make things right." As the evening shift arrived, they found their colleagues already implementing changes. The tired cynicism that had plagued the precinct was being replaced by something new, a reminder of why they'd chosen this path in the first place. 2 weeks after the budget meeting, the precinct buzzed with a different kind of energy. The front desk, once cluttered with ignored paperwork, now featured a clean, organized system. A small coffee station had been set up in the waiting area, making it more welcoming for visitors. The young officer who'd once laughed at David was leading a morning briefing, something that would have been unthinkable just weeks ago. "Yesterday, we responded to every call within 20 minutes, he announced proudly, pointing to the new digital tracking board. His fellow officers nodded in approval, a far cry from the dismissive attitudes of the past. A grandfather walked in, worried about suspicious activity near the local playground. Instead of being handed a form and told to wait, he was immediately introduced to the community outreach officer. They sat together, reviewing security camera footage and discussing increased patrols during children's play hours. "You know what's different?" one veteran officer said during their lunch break. "We're not just policing anymore. We're actually part of the community." He watched through the window as his partner helped an elderly man change a flat tire in the parking lot. Small acts of kindness had become the new normal. The complaint box that had once overflowed was now emptied and processed daily. Each concern was logged, tracked, and followed up on. The chief had started a weekly review meeting where they discussed response times and community feedback, celebrating improvements and addressing any shortfalls. In the break room, officers shared stories of positive interactions. One told about helping a lost child find their parents, another about organizing a neighborhood watch program. The cynicism that had once filled these conversations was replaced by genuine enthusiasm for making a difference. A group of local business owners arrived for the first community advisory meeting, another new initiative. They sat around a large table with officers, discussing concerns and solutions together. The wall behind them displayed photos of recent community events where officers had participated, building bridges they'd once thought impossible. The younger officer checked his phone, finding a message from David. The congressman had been keeping tabs on their progress, offering guidance and support rather than criticism. "Keep up the good work," the message read, alongside data showing their improved response times and community satisfaction ratings. Outside, a patrol car returned from their round. The officers had spent the morning visiting local schools, not just as authority figures, but as friendly faces the children could trust. They carried drawings the kids had made, pictures of police officers helping people, now proudly displayed on the precinct's community corner board. The desk sergeant, who'd once barely acknowledged visitors, was teaching a new recruit about proper citizen interaction. "Remember," he said, "that person coming through the door might be having the worst day of their life. Our job is to make it better, not worse." Late afternoon brought a surprise visit from a family whose home had recently been burglarized. They'd come not to complain, but to thank the officers who responded so quickly and followed up regularly. The officers gathered around, sharing cookies the family had brought, creating the kind of moment that reminded everyone why they joined the force. As the day shift wound down, the chief stood in his office doorway, watching his transformed precinct. The walls that had once been bare now showed community event calendars, response time tracking boards, and thank you notes from citizens. It wasn't just about following new rules, it was about rediscovering their purpose. The local morning news van pulled up outside the precinct, their camera crew setting up for a special report. Word had spread about the remarkable changes in the police department, and people wanted to know how it happened. The young officer who'd once dismissed David now stood nervously before the cameras, straightening his uniform. 6 weeks ago, I was part of the problem, he admitted honestly to the reporter. We thought we were doing our job, but we'd forgotten what that job really meant. Behind him, the precinct doors opened and closed steadily, each citizen being greeted with respect and attention. Inside, a local newspaper reporter watched as officers handled the morning rush. She scribbled notes about the coffee station, the clean waiting area, and the way every person was treated with dignity. The overflowing complaint box that had once symbolized neglect was now replaced by a digital system where every concern was tracked and addressed. "You should have seen this place before," an elderly resident told the reporter. She'd brought cookies for the officers who'd helped clean up her neighborhood park. "Now when we call, they come. When we worry, they listen. It's like having guardians instead of just police." The chief walked a group of visitors through the precinct, showing off their new community engagement board. Photos showed officers at local events, reading to children at the library, helping at the food bank, teaching safety classes at the community center. "This isn't just about law enforcement anymore," he explained. It's about being part of the community we serve. Outside, a group of small business owners chatted with patrol officers during their coffee break. They talked about recent improvements in response times, about feeling safer, about finally having partners in keeping their neighborhoods secure. The officers knew their names, asked about their families, shared genuine laughs. The young officer continued his interview, describing the day everything changed. We had this guy come in, dressed in regular clothes, asking for help. We treated him like he didn't matter. He paused, shaking his head at the memory. Turns out he was the congressman in charge of our funding. But you know what? He didn't punish us. He showed us a better way. A mother walked in with her young daughter, who immediately ran to hug one of the officers. Last month, he'd found her lost puppy and personally delivered it to their home. These small acts of kindness, once rare, had become daily occurrences. The newspaper reporter interviewed the desk surgeon, who'd once been too busy with his phone to help people. I keep that old complaint box in my office, he admitted. It reminds me of how not to do this job. Every person who walks through that door is someone's family member, someone's loved one. They deserve our best. By afternoon, social media was buzzing with the news coverage. People shared their own positive experiences with the reformed precinct. One post showed an officer helping an elderly man with groceries. Another praised the quick response to a neighborhood concern. The transformation had become a model for other departments to follow. The last interview of the day was with a longtime resident who'd witnessed the change firsthand. It's not just about better policing, she said, her eyes bright with emotion. It's about feeling like we matter, like our concerns matter, like we're all in this together. The conference room was packed with police chiefs from other precincts across the state. They'd all come to learn about the remarkable transformation that had caught everyone's attention. The young officer who'd once mocked David now stood at the podium, sharing their journey with genuine humility. 2 months ago, we were the department nobody wanted to deal with, he began, clicking through slides showing their old waiting room, the overflowing complaint box, the disorganized desk. Several chiefs in the audience nodded, recognizing similar issues in their own stations. A video played on the screen, their old security footage showing dismissive treatment of citizens, followed by clips of their current approach. The contrast was striking. In the back of the room, David sat quietly, watching his former critics become teachers of positive change. The hardest part wasn't changing our procedures, the officer continued, his voice steady. It was changing our mindset. We had to remember why we chose this job in the first place. He shared stories of elderly residents now feeling safe enough to walk in their neighborhoods again, of children waving at patrol cars instead of hiding from them. During the lunch break, police chiefs gathered around tables, sharing their own challenges. One admitted his precinct had similar problems with response times in certain neighborhoods. Another talked about the growing disconnect between officers and the community they served. The afternoon session featured their desk surgeon, now a model of professional courtesy. He demonstrated their new digital tracking system, showing how every citizen complaint was logged, followed up on, and resolved. Last week, a woman came in about a stolen bicycle, he shared. 2 months ago, we would have handed her a form and forgotten about it. Now, we found her bike within 24 hours. Other officers joined in, each sharing a piece of their transformation story. They talked about the community coffee meetings they'd started, the school outreach programs, the regular neighborhood walks where officers got to know local residents. Simple changes that made huge differences. A small business owner was invited to speak, telling how the improved police presence had helped reduce shoplifting in her area. But it's more than that, she explained, smiling at the officers she now knew by name. They're part of our community now. They know our concerns, our families, our stories. The young officer returned to the podium, pulling up their latest response time data. The improvement was clear, calls answered quickly, follow-ups documented, positive feedback flowing in from all neighborhoods. But numbers don't tell the whole story, he said. "It's about the trust we've rebuilt." As the presentation ended, police chiefs lined up to ask questions, take notes, and request guidance on implementing similar changes. The transformation of one precinct was becoming a movement, spreading hope for better community policing everywhere. In the hallway, David chatted with some of the visiting chiefs. The funding was never the real issue, he explained. It was about remembering that every person who walks through those doors deserves respect. He watched as his former critics expertly guided other departments toward positive change. The day ended with a community dinner in the precinct parking lot. Officers, citizens, and visiting police chiefs shared meals and stories under string lights. Children played safely nearby, elderly residents chatted comfortably with officers, and the barriers that had once seemed so permanent continued to fall. 1 year later, David walked into the precinct wearing his casual clothes, just like that first day. But this time, everything was different. The waiting area buzzed with positive energy, filled with natural light and friendly faces. Children's drawings decorated the walls, showing police officers as community heroes. The desk sergeant, who'd once been glued to his phone, jumped up with a warm smile. "Good morning, sir. Great to see you again." Behind him, a digital board showed response times across all neighborhoods, all consistently under 15 minutes. The old complaint box sat in a glass case nearby, labeled "How Far We've Come." A group of new recruits was getting their orientation. The young officer who'd once laughed at David was now their trainer, using his own story as a lesson in humility and growth. "See that man over there?" he said, pointing to David. "He taught us that real power isn't about authority. It's about serving others." The hallways were lined with photos showing a year of positive changes. Officers reading to kids at the library, community picnics in previously troubled neighborhoods, senior citizens' safety workshops. Each picture told a story of bridges built and trust restored. David paused at the community bulletin board, now covered with thank you notes from residents. One caught his eye. A letter from the elderly woman he'd seen that first day, writing about how safe she felt in her neighborhood now. Next to it hung a chart showing crime rates dropping across all areas. The chief invited David into his office, once a closed-off space, but now with an open-door policy. "You know," the chief said, "other precincts keep asking how we made such big changes. I tell them it started with one person being brave enough to show us our mistakes." Outside, patrol officers chatted with local shop owners during their walking rounds. Kids rode their bikes freely, waving at police cars instead of avoiding them. The fear and distrust that had once divided the community had been replaced by something remarkable: genuine connection. The young officer joined them, sharing their latest initiative, a mentoring program for at-risk youth. "Remember when we thought budget cuts were our biggest worry?" He laughed. "Turns out, we just needed to remember why we chose this job in the first place." A call came in. Someone needed help changing a flat tire. Instead of dismissing it as not real police work, an officer immediately headed out. These small acts of kindness had become their new standard. Every call mattered. Every person counted. David walked through the parking lot, remembering that evening a year ago when he'd left feeling disappointed and angry. Now, he watched as officers ended their shifts by checking on elderly residents, helping kids with homework in the community room, and truly protecting and serving. The precinct had become a model for others across the country. Regular visitors from other departments came to learn their methods. But more importantly, they'd become a true part of their community. The us versus them mentality had been replaced by a simple truth: we're all in this together. As David headed home, he passed the spot where he parked that first day. A new sign stood there now. Every person matters. Every call counts. Every day is a chance to make a difference. Below it, officers and residents gathered for their weekly community meeting, planning together for an even better tomorrow. The greatest change wasn't in the building or the procedures. It was in the hearts and minds of everyone involved. What started as a lesson in accountability had grown into something much more valuable. A blueprint for how police and communities could work together, built on respect, understanding, and genuine care for every person who walked through those doors.